crimes, not only in Gaza, but extensively in the West Bank. And those who have another proposal as to what Hamas as what resistance ought to take, do have a moral grounds to criticize those actions. Okay, just as those in Germany who were calling for an end to Nazi aggression, you know, they couldn't because they get killed, but we're free to do it here, would have had a justification in condemning the terrorism of the partisans. They didn't have a justification for supporting the Gestapo slogan, terror against terror. You commit terror, we'll commit worse terror. The only people in Germany who had a right to criticize the terror that they were attacking were those who were trying to stop the far greater atrocities of the Nazis. Same with Kristallnacht, same with many other cases. The same with the American Revolution. I mean, the American, you know, the patriots, as we call them, we're terrorist forces. I mean, in those days, terrorism wasn't as extreme as it is today, nor was military conflict. But, yeah, it was serious. I mean, that's why the number of people who fled the colonies after independence was higher, or approximately the same, as the proportion of the population that fled Vietnam after the U.S. withdrew. They fled the terror of the victors. I mean, there were people fleeing from Boston Harbor, writing pathetic letters about how they were dying in the snow in Nova Scotia because they just had to get away from these terrorists who won the war. This is not a major theme of American history, but you can find the facts if you like. And they had good reason to, because yes, Nathaniel Greene's forces, for example, were straight terrorist forces. And of course the British objected to this. How dare they hide, you know, in civilian places to shoot at our soldiers. As for the well-documented facts that you mentioned, the documentation is zero. The sole source for those claims is Israeli propaganda. Maybe it's true, you know, maybe it isn't. It's hard to imagine where you could hide in Gaza or live in Gaza, except near a civilian target. Israel, of course, does it all the time. So if you ask where the Israeli military command is, yeah, it's right in the middle of the cities. Where are they going to put it? Sure, even though the documentation happens to be zero, not well documented, nevertheless it's almost certainly true, and it offers no justification whatsoever for destroying the universities, destroying the schools, mental health clinics, attacking hospitals, shooting at ambulances, all the other crimes that you can read about if you want to bother looking. And the crimes are really serious. So actually I brought with me a report, which I have not seen reported in the American press, from the, let's see if I can find it, from the Gaza water utility. This is January 10th, a press release. They describe, I won't bother reading it, but they essentially describe how hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza are without water because of Israeli attacks on water systems and also attacks on sewage systems and, in fact, power plants, which make anything run, so that one discharging pond is leading to a major catastrophe that threatens the lives of thousands of people just by drowning in sewage flooding. Well, okay, sure, some Israeli propagandist can tell you, yeah, there was a mortar hidden in the sewage system. Maybe there was. Does that have anything to do with these atrocities? Nothing, you know, for very simple reasons, the ones I mentioned. There is a right to resort to violence in self-defense if there are no alternatives. And in this case, there are very clear alternatives. Stop the criminal activities and accept the peace treaty. Okay? Not very hard. Stop your crimes, and that'll end the rocketing that you're concerned with. Excuse me.
Professor Chomsky, while this may seem obvious, because you've touched on it time and time again, why is it that the U.S. media appears to completely lap up the propaganda while appearing to not do any sort of objective journalism, which is what every single journalist student has, studied to do. What in the world is going on?
Well, for one thing, the U.S. media are just as good as any others. If I had one newspaper in the world to read, I couldn't read any other, I'd pick the New York Times. Just, I don't love it, as you know. And the reporters themselves, not so much in the case of Israel, but in many cases, are courageous, honest. They report what's before their eyes, objective, if you like, but very typically, consistently, within a framework of interpretation that's subordinated to state corporate propaganda. That's unconscious. And it's true of the intellectual community generally. One of the reasons I write about the media is because it's easier to study the New York Times systematically than, say, to study academic scholarship systematically. That's a huge effort beyond my resources. But it's basically the same. There aren't many differences. And it's the same in the general educated population. There is an assumption that the U.S. cannot do anything wrong. It can make mistakes, but can't do anything wrong. Individuals may do things wrong, like there may be a bad apple here and there, but we can't do anything wrong as a people. So take, say, the invasion of Iraq. Barack Obama is praised, even by the left, for what's called his principled opposition to the Iraq war. What was his principled opposition? Basically, we can't get away with it. He says it was a strategic blunder. Okay, you go back to Pravda in the 1980s, when the Russians were invading Afghanistan. There are plenty of people saying it's a strategic blunder. We don't call that principled opposition to the war. After Stalingrad, there were plenty of Nazi generals who say, look, it was a strategic blunder to open a two-front war. Are they principled opponents of the Nazis? The very idea that this is called principled opposition is a very interesting insight into our own intellectual and moral culture. It's totally unprincipled. It's based on nothing except cost to us. Maybe there's a couple of words about, I don't like civilian casualties. But it's very hard to find any principled opposition in the culture, in the intellectual culture generally. And it's also true of things that go way back. So take the Vietnam War. There's been, reams of material on that. But try to find a principled criticism of it in the mainstream. If you look at the literature of, say, diplomatic history today, or anything that goes way back, you find two positions. They're the hawks, who say, with more force we could have won. And they're the doves who say it was a lost cause, which was a mistake. Take Arthur Schlesinger, who's a leading American historian, Kennedy advisor, one of the most outspoken doves. He was a strong supporter of the war under Kennedy to the extent that he paid any attention to it at all. In fact, he paid almost no attention to it, even though Kennedy did directly attack South Vietnam and carried out many atrocities. But if you look in Schlesinger's journals, which just appeared, almost day-to-day record of everything he did, there isn't even a mention of Vietnam until the Johnson years. There's a lot about swimming pools and who jumped in naked and that sort of thing, but nothing about Vietnam. But by 1966, 67, he was, like others, becoming critical of the war. And he wrote a book which is considered one of the important criticisms of the war. It's called Bitter Heritage. And he was very explicit, nothing hidden. He described his controversy with his friend Joseph Alsop, a major journalist who was a strong supporter of the war. And Schlesinger said something like this. She said, we all pray that Mr. Alsop is right, and that with more force, the surge of the day, we will be able to win victory in a land of wreck and ruin, with everything destroyed and so on and so forth. That's what we all pray, but it probably won't work. And then he said, if Mr. Alsop is right, and we do win victory in this devastated